Hey everybody, welcome to the new normal. I hope everybody's safe. I am praying for you guys and we will get through this together. So what I want to do with this is just kind of summarize some of the ideas we've been dealing with Beowulf and Gawain, and then I'll probably do one that has to do with Chaucer once we get through this week. I'm going to do this in a couple of parts because it's reasonably long, and I'm going to try not to be long-winded, which would be a miracle, but I'm going to do my best. So here we go. So in terms of language and content, Sir Gawain is a very different poem because of its French influence. So it has the bob and wheel, that little bit at the end of each stanza. It's rhymed and it has meter. So those are French and Italian influences that did not exist in Beowulf. There's a massive vocabulary increase with French and Latin words being added in Sir Gawain. And this really important element of romance and chivalry, and this was imported mostly from France, although it was going on in Spain and Italy as well. But this idea of just the social behavior of knights with other elements of society, the relationship between the aristocracy and the knighthood and the common people and that sort of thing was much more important. And we'll get to why later, but it had to do with the unity of England. Also, the classical learning is much more integrated and evident in Sir Gawain. Beowulf exhibited characteristics and elements that showed the poet knew epic poetry, but it wasn't really an integral part of the structure of the story. In Gawain, this all changes. Classical figures are mentioned by name. So Epicurus, Zeno is another one. Boethius gets mentioned. The Trojan War is mentioned. Aeneas, who's a classical figure. So that's obvious that the poet was up on his classical mythology and classical history, but also the elements of the epic poetry were much more clearly integrated. So the descriptions of Gawain putting on his armor, for one thing, the mention of Troy, and then the closing of the poem with Troy. Those things are structural things that show obviously that the writer was going for a kind of epic sort of poem. He didn't accomplish it in the classical sense, but he certainly did his best. The other really important element with language and content is the Christianity and the paganism, which I'm going to get to in the next part of this, one coming up, but it's much more balanced. And Beowulf was like, if you imagine the paganism as a kind of square peg, it was like the Christianity's round hole. Like he was trying to jam a round hole over a square peg. It was really awkward, and it often contradicted itself. And it was, characters that were thoroughly pagan were all of a sudden would spout like, praises to God. And it just didn't really work that well from an artistic point of view. Gawain, that problem doesn't exist. Characters and setting. Well, yeah, so this is important stuff too, right? So the big difference is the characters in Sir Gawain the Green Knight are much more like real people, right? They're three-dimensional. They've got feelings, they've got fears, they doubt themselves, right? They have secrets. That's really just not true in Beowulf. They're just there. They are what they are. They do what they do, and that's what it is. They're flat and two-dimensional. Another character importance in Gawain is the females are much more sexualized in Sir Gawain. They're devious, they're cunning, they're seductive. And in the case of Lady Bertilac, it's her gender, her sex that allows her to do the things she does. That's why she's the temptation to Gawain. If she were a man, it wouldn't work. Anyway, I'll leave that where it is. But right, so it's her femininity that is, and so she needs to have femininity, and so the writer gives her femininity. Wealhtheow, Wargrendel's mother, the fact that they're female is an afterthought. Wealhtheow is respected and loved and revered, but it has nothing to do with her gender. It's her social position that does that. And it's important here. This is an important thing to note in terms of Zemeckis' movie. That's all bets are off. They're not like the characters in Beowulf. They're much more like the characters in Sir Gawain the Green Knight, but they're even more like characters in today's society because the movie was made today. So that's an important difference to keep in mind between Beowulf the poem and Beowulf the movie, right? So Gawain is on its way to becoming like the movie in terms of its treatment of women, but it's not there because, well, we're still 1400. Characters and setting continued. Gawain's setting is England. I mean, obviously Beowulf's is Denmark, but more than that, you could look at Beowulf as a kind of English Denmark, sort of like Hamlet's or Shakespeare's Hamlet is an English Denmark. But it's not really much like England because there wasn't an England to be like, right? But by the time Gawain rolls around in 1400, there is an England. And that stability came from William. It took an invasion, but the invasion created a kind of stability. There was a centralized, strong government. There was currency, right? There were universities. The church had much more consistent influence. There was trade. All this stuff created this much more unified and coherent England. The heptarchy of the Anglo-Saxons was gone. These 7 loosely connected kingdoms. It's now one big, fairly coherent, large area, and people knew it as England. And other countries knew it as England, right? So as a result, one of the results of this is that Gawain the Green Knight is really not just about what a hero is like, or what a Christian hero is like Beowulf would have been, but it's also what a good Englishman is about, right? So a good Englishman is brave and courageous, and a good Englishman is Christian, just like in Beowulf. But a good Englishman is also moral and behaves properly. He follows social rules and etiquette, and he doesn't cheat sexually or in any other way. He's good to his friends. He's loyal. He tells the truth, like that sort of thing. All of which were not really important in Beowulf, but they are now 400 years later. Some of the themes that are important in these poems is particularly heroism and villainy, which we've really been talking about. This will be the last thing I do for this video. I'll pick up in the next one. But we've been talking about heroism, right? And Gawain is a hero, just like Beowulf was a hero. And both fight physical threats, right? Beowulf battles Grendel's mother, the dragon, but Gawain also fights ogres and trolls and werewolves and all kinds of things on his way to Berdalac's castle. The poem doesn't dwell on that because that's not the point of the poem, like it was the point of Beowulf. So they are both physical heroes and quite formidable soldiers, right? But Gawain is different because he also fights moral and spiritual threats. The Green Knight is a physical threat, but he's also a moral and spiritual threat. Grendel's mother, they're just physical threats. Likewise, the villains are more sophisticated in Sir Gawain. Like the Green Knight is definitely the strongest person anyone had ever seen, but he's also the smartest, right? He possesses a kind of cleverness that none of the villains in Beowulf possessed at all. He is cunning, and that's true of Lady Berdalac as well, and Berdalac himself, right? But who is the Green Knight? Lady Berdalac, her strength is in her beauty and her deviousness, right? She uses her brains to try and trick Gawain when she goes into his bedroom, and each day she offers a different temptation. The temptation is basically the same every day, but the way she tempts him, the arguments she uses are different. She uses quickness, she uses assertiveness, and then she uses just flat out trickery at the end to represent the deer, the boar, and the fox in her arguments. So the villainy is strong, the villains are strong and clever, the heroes are morally challenged, right? And they're imperfect. Gawain makes mistakes, and this is a lot like the Dark Knight, right? Batman is much more like Gawain, and the Joker is much more like the Green Knight. The Joker's threat is physical. Batman's struggle is physical. Batman is physically strong. The Joker is capable of physical violence. But the real battle in that movie is the same as the real battle in this poem, and that is they're both fighting moral wars. Gawain is fighting a moral war to uphold Englishness and Christianity and goodness and truth and justice. That's what the symbolism of the battle is. If he gives in or fails, then Arthur's court fails, and then Englishness fails. Similarly with Batman, if the Joker can get Batman to give up his ideal and kill him, then the whole idea of Batman is destroyed. And Harvey Dent is important because he represents the future. If the Joker can corrupt the future, hope, and all those things that it represents, then he can take the soul of Gotham. So the battle in both of these poems is moral, and the heroism And the villainy in Gawain is much closer to a modern idea than, say, Beowulf's was. So I'll pick up the next one in the next video, and we'll go from there. This is the chart I'm going to show you, by the way, but I'll get there when I get there. Talk to you soon.